The only war that matters is the war against imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. There is no way out of a spiritual battle. There is no way you can avoid taking sides. There is no way you cannot have a poetics. No matter what you do, plumber, baker, teacher, you do in the consciousness of making or not making your world. You do in the consciousness of making or not making your world. By the way, the only war that matters is the war against imagination. You have a poetics. You step into the world like a suit of ready-made clothes, or you etch in light. Your firmament spills into the shape of your room, the shape of the poem, of your body, of your loves. A woman's life, a man's life is an allegory. Dig it. There is no way out of the spiritual battle. The war is the war against the imagination. You can't sign up as a conscientious objector. That is from Diane DePrima's rant, Beat Poet. And it's a long rant. I just gave you a little sampling. That's what I was thinking about just now. I think because of what Patty was saying about this, about Emma and about marches and some of the content of these songs, and the only war is the war against imagination. And I want to be a promoter of imagination, not shut it down. It's a complicated world, and we think we need solutions to problems. And yeah, there are problems, and we need some solutions. But what we need more than that is some imagination. Some wild, unfiltered, creative imagination. And apparently our young people, thank God, have some imagination and some nuance. Very surprised at the nuance that's being brought into the conversation at this point in time. I was thinking about the Lakota elders who, after they sent their young people out on the vision fast, when they came back, they would ask them, "What did you see?" They wanted to know. And then, once they heard about the contents of their imagination, the entire tribe would enact it out as a play. There's a word for that. It's called being an elder. Even the dog knows what I'm talking about. There's a kind of reciprocal, creative cauldron of possibility. Or you can stay in your room with your door locked and your single news source and say, "F all y'all, I've got my own opinions. I don't want to hear about your imagination." Anyway, that's not at all what I want to say this morning, and it's also what I want to say this morning. I want to talk about the more than human world. That's a line from David Abram. I think it's a lovely phrase, the more than human world. It's just a subtle reminder that even the black swallowtail butterfly? Now, what could they possibly be talking about in committee that they're trying to have it as the state butterfly? What could they possibly be talking about? Like, are people lobbying for the monarch? Or, what? I don't even understand what the problem is. trying to get that one passed. But that's a failure of imagination, because the only war that matters is the war against imagination. All other wars are subsumed in it. So yeah, the more than human war. We're talking about the good life. Let me remind you of what I talked about 2 weeks ago when I started my contribution to this unfolding conversation. Here's a summary of my entire talk. Don't be an idiot. Because the idiot in Greek means the private person. And the Greek philosophers like Aristotle, their great gift to the human conversation was, you cannot have a privatized happiness. It has to include the community, the polis, the city. That's largely the realm of the human. But they're saying you can't close yourself off in your room. Virtue, morality is a communal conversation, and that is part of the pursuit of the good life. And I also mentioned that Aristotle did not by that mean just being happy. He meant something like flourishing. That your flourishing, your private, individual, psycho-spiritual flourishing is dependent upon the flourishing of other people. It is. That's why I threw in Jesus' little line here, whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. That's a reciprocal relation that involves the other. So now I want to do part 2 of that notion and talk about the more than human world. If that's true on the human level, in the polis for the Greeks, might it also be true for the black swallowtail butterfly? That's what I want to poke around in today. The notion of our relationship with the more than human world. And it's good timing because I just came back from 5 days in Joshua Tree. Not 5 days listening to the Joshua Tree album, always a good idea, but the national park, which is the size of Rhode Island in California. I'm in a program. I'm in a program through a place called Animas Valley Institute, and I'm training to be a guide in this kind of stuff. I don't mean like wilderness guide, like let's start a fire, that kind of stuff. More in the world of psycho-spiritual world, taking people out into the wild or the semi-wild world and having a kind of intimate conversation. So I'm just coming off of that, and strange things happen to you in the desert. Number one, your strategic ego mind eventually gives up, at least a little bit. And because the natural environment is just the natural environment, and it wears you down a bit. It wears who you think you are in the world. You can't strut around in the desert. If you have ever walked by a cholla cactus, some people call them the jumping cactus because somehow they manage to leap onto you and attack your leg. So you can't just march around like you own the place. You have to enter into a kind of cooperative dance just to stay alive, I suppose, in the desert. Other things, strange things happen to you. There's a kind of recognition, at least for me, I'm speaking personally, that it's, in a way, you can't say anymore that the world was created. Maybe you could never say that. Because what happens when you begin to be aware of the way the natural world unfolds is that you realize that everything is being created in the moment. There's not some static thing that happened back then and we're sort of living in the aftermath. While I was there, I was in one particular place for 5 days. And over the course of 5 days, I could see the cottonwood leaf unfolding. It's not like it went from winter to spring overnight. It's a very slow unfolding. Well, which part of that moment is creation? Well, whatever part you happen to be living in. Creation simply is happening. All things are unfolding as they are in the moment in which they're unfolding, which is a kind of mystical and also scientific view of the world. Like, I just thought of another line from a poem. No two branches are the same to Wren. Who's that? No two branches are the same to Wren. That's David Wagner. David White? You think it's White? It's one of the Davids. David Dean, maybe. No two branches are the same to Wren. Yeah, you might be right. That might be David White. And another thing that happens to you in the desert is that you suddenly realize that you are a participant in the universe. You're a participant. You are in the process of even co-creating something just by your mere existence, as all things are in the process of co-creating something. So my point this morning is, in terms of the natural world, also don't be an idiot. Be a privatized person. So I've been reading this book called The Hidden Life of Trees. Have you heard of it? Okay. This is a fantastic book. Okay, take a wild guess. Have you ever seen a sapling in a forest, say underneath a silver maple? It's basically the offspring of that particular tree. And sometimes if you have eyes to see and you stay in one place long enough, you can see they form a kind of ring almost around the tree. You can see it. It's like the earth. It's like the cosmos. It's the children and grandchildren of the a mature adult tree. And saplings, if you look at them, oftentimes they're no bigger than about the size of a pencil or a thick pencil. You've seen these? Take a wild guess how old they are. Just give me something right now. 2 years. Great guess. Anyone want to throw in something else?
10 years.
10 years. Great guess. You want to know? In a healthy forest, they're anywhere between 80 and 120 years old. Right now you're thinking BS. Buy the book, okay? Because, unbelievably, trees do not operate by survival of the fittest. In fact, that's not even what Darwin said, by the way. It's not a world of dog-eat-dog competition. In fact, they're in a kind of cooperative relationship. The adult tree does not want the saplings to have much photosynthesis. So they don't. They're basically starved of light. So you know how they eat? The adult tree sends nutrients through the root system to the root system of the sapling. They share. Trees share. And they used to think that a healthy tree, like the way forestry was dealt with in the United States and also in Europe too, is let's cut down the trees around a tree so it will grow up more healthy. It actually produces a sicker tree in the end. It actually forces a kind of dog-eat-dog survival of the fittest, when actually trees that are packed together are the healthiest. You know why? Because they feed the sick ones. If a tree gets sick, even if a tree is cut down, they will still feed the stump. Because it too has something to give to the culture, that's essentially what it is, of that tiny patch of earth community. And if that's true of trees, it's probably true of all things. I'll give you an example. The human body has bacteria in it. You're familiar with this? Guess what? It's not part of your cellular makeup. Did you know that? It's not actually you. Like, you can't say, it's my bacteria is my bacteria. Get away from my stuff. You can't take my stuff. It doesn't belong to you. But there are 10 times as much bacteria in your body as human cells. You're more bacteria, and your health is in an interdependent relationship with the cosmos, that's my language, of bacteria in your body. If it's sick, you're sick. If you're sick, it's sick. Did you know that? It's incredible. So you can't even say, this is my body. Well, which part of it is yours? Do you hear what I'm saying? Just how interdependent is the universe. Now, the great interdependence of all things has always been a mystical insight of all the best religious traditions. Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, indigenous, more nature-based religions, all had that kind of intuition. Now we know that scientifically, that we live in an interconnected, interdependent web of the more than human world. And we also know, probably more with more specificity than any time in human history, that if something is sick, quote, out there, it directly relates our health. Even if you want to think like a good narcissist. A good narcissist, like the one in the White House, should be working very hard to make sure the rainforests are not cut down, because it's directly related to his or her personal health. Do you get what I'm saying? But that's a lack of awareness. When I pick on Trump, by the way, I love to pick on Trump because it's so easy, but I do it because he mirrors back to us, I'm going to keep saying to it, he mirrors back to us our own narcissistic tendencies. It's a giant mirror saying, take a look at yourself. By the way, that was in the Simpsons episode just recently. You should watch that. We now have corporate sponsors. Today's message is brought to you by the Simpsons. Okay. So we live in a kind of self-regulating, cooperative, communal reality. Yet we strut around as if that's not true. It's part of the curse of, I think, becoming conscious. We could have a whole conversation about what is consciousness. I'll give you my very brief definition. Consciousness is the ability to ask the question, what is consciousness? Something like that. So I wanted to point out just very briefly the roots of some of our separation. If what I'm saying is true, that all things are interrelated, that the health of the black swallowtail butterfly and your well-being are related. We know that. That's a fact. It's not fake news. It's a fact. We know this is the case. How come we don't live that way? How come our conscious attention isn't turned toward that? And that's a very complicated and complex and very, it would take probably a lifetime to unpack that. And some of it has to do with the evolution of consciousness itself. And things I've mentioned many times, egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, ecocentric, as consciousness develops, is part of the answer to that. But let's pick on the Bible for a minute. If you open up the Bible, in the very first chapter, you have a cosmology. By the way, speaking of cosmology, the opening line in the poem, The Rant, which I started this morning with, says, oh, I'll just look it up. I looked up my phone. Oh, I'm very excited. All right, where is this? Come on. You cannot write a single line without a cosmology. That's the opening line. You cannot write a single line without a cosmology, without a coherent, somewhat coherent view of what's true in the world, of what is ultimately true in the world. You cannot write a line without a cosmology. So you open up the Bible and you have a cosmology. It's a very interesting cosmology. You have a kind of explanation about what is reality. That's what they're trying to describe. It's not actually a story about how the universe came into being. That's a very different kind of notion. It's a cosmology in the truest sense of the word. And it says in there, you've probably heard this line, be fruitful and multiply, correct? What does that mean? Make babies. That's what we took it to mean. And actually, there's a whole theology around such a thing that even certain parts of the Catholic Church still adhere to. Like, you shouldn't have contraceptives because it says, be fruitful and multiply. That creates a whole cultural landscape, way of thinking in the world, directly related to biblical interpretation. The Bible matters, by the way. I know people keep saying it doesn't. I'm telling you, the entire Western world stands on the back of biblical interpretation. It does. Like, The reason why you're all sitting here, and most of you are not Native American as far as I know, is because of something called manifest destiny. It's ours for the taking, rooted in biblical interpretation. In a view of the Bible, certain worldview. So anyway, what was I saying? Be fruitful and multiply. However, let's give the Bible a little more credit than that. You know what it also says right before that? Elohim, as God is called in the first chapter of the book, says, be fruitful and multiply first to the plants and animals. Did you know that? Then turns attention to the human beings. Now, what does that tell you about a cosmology? It tells you that the fruitfulness of every living creature is just as important to the writer of that particular poem as human beings making babies. Does that make sense? And it's very close to what Aristotle meant by flourishing, if we were to interpret that particular biblical word. Be fruitful and multiply. The well-being, the flourishing of every living thing on earth, plant, animal, let's throw in the stones, they're alive too, matters. That's a profound, mystical vision of the world. And you matter too. Be fruitful and multiply. Flourish. But your flourishing doesn't necessarily trump the flourishing of every living thing. That's in the Bible. Now, of course, it also says, subdue the earth. You're familiar with that line? That comes right after all this. Now, I mean, we can get into the worldview, and these are agrarian people, and there's a major battle, basically, between the emerging city-state and sort of a more subsistence kind of living. That's the time in which the Bible was written, so culture is changing. And subduing the earth, they meant things like, what if we created a water channel from the river and brought it over here to this garden and planted some things? That does change the landscape, doesn't it? In some ways, it's harmful. It is. But it's a little different than our technological capacities that we have now. Like, we want to drive our cars, so let's cut down an entire mountain. Or turn on our lights. Isn't that a coal-fired power plant here? Yeah. Thank you, West Virginia, for giving us your mountains. You know? Or some of it's probably imported now from Croatia. I made that up, by the way. No idea. Some of you are like, is it? So, the reason why I'm bringing up the Bible is because of certain forms of biblical interpretation and because of the Enlightenment, we came, all of us, up through a worldview that tended to view everything as subject-object. And we are the masters. We are the masters of our fate, the captains of our soul. We are in charge. And everything else is a natural, quote, resource. And after all, the Bible says, subdue the earth. So let's cut it down. Let's burn it down. Let's use it for our own benefit. That's a very narrow thing. I'm telling you, already the Bible doesn't allow for such a thing because you still, lodged in the back of your throat, is this other line that says the flourishing of all of life matters. So the invitation is to continue in a kind of cooperative dance. That's the way I would put it, a kind of cooperative dance. And I think we have to say in a very conscious way, our Western way of looking at things, rooted largely in biblical interpretation, is making the world sicker, not healthier. How do we know that? Don't you feel sick? Yeah. The world is getting sicker. Now, it's not all gloom and doom. I realize that. But in terms of psychological well-being, flourishing of community, flourishing of life, something seems to be spinning out of control. So, let me share a little story. Joanna Macy, what do I call her? Ecologist, Buddhist scholar, activist. Anyone ever heard of Joanna Macy? Okay, really incredible human being. She tells a story about a friend of hers who was an activist around rainforest kinds of things. And this was in the early days, in the 60s and 70s. And the early days, some of you laughed. My bad. It's hard to dig yourself out of that one, so just leave it. Anyway, so he and his group of friends would go and stand in front of these bulldozers in the Amazon, and trying to protect just one tree at a time, really. And it first started off with very much a mentality of saving the earth. Okay? We should save the earth, as if the earth is somehow separate from who we are. But again, very noble idea. We're going to come in, kind of superhero mentality, and fix and save the problem. And he said one day he was standing there and facing the bulldozers. And he had this feeling in his body that he should turn around. So he turned around and faced the rainforest. And something came over him that, in his words, was kind of less like a thought and more like a sort of felt reality. And this is what he said. He said that the rainforest is protecting itself from with this recently emerged being that's become conscious. Do you hear what he's saying? Human beings are the product of the rainforest itself. We are, in fact, the most recent thing to evolve from the earth itself. How did we evolve? We can talk about that. What did we evolve into? A kind of being that's conscious and can turn around and face the rainforest. All we are conscious manifestations of the rainforest, which is a very different notion of we're going to fly in like Superman and save this thing out there, object. It's a subject kind of world. Now, that's a kind of numinous experience. That's, to use some good Jungian language, it's a numinous experience. I don't know what your experiences are like. But the notion behind that is very profound. It tells us something, if it's true, which it is on a scientific level, that we are deeply interwoven with everything on the planet. In a way, the rainforest is just trying to protect itself. Maybe all things are doing so in a kind of cooperative dance. The question is, as a conscious human being, which all the terror that comes with it, do you want to be a participant? Or do you want to be a conscientious objector? Say, nah, just going to go about my business. Let me do my thing. And to hell with everything else. That's, I think, the invitation, the kind of ask from such a thing, which is why I put this Eckhart Tolle quote in here. Listen to it again. You are not in the universe. You're not in the universe. You are the universe. Just like you are the rainforest, only recently becoming conscious of the rainforest. Some of you are like, could that really be true? Do you see how ingrained we are in the subject-object? Subject seems a little woo-woo, like we're going to all be in California in an ashram in 2 months. You are not in the universe. You are the universe. An intrinsic part of it. Ultimately, you are not a person. You are not a person, but a focal point where the universe is becoming conscious of itself. That is what this person defending the rainforest experienced. What an amazing miracle. So I think perhaps one of the biggest tasks of the 21st century, in my humble opinion, is to, in whatever way we can, turn toward the interrelated, cooperative dance of the universe itself, which is very hard to do because anxiety and fear makes us want to go in the other direction. which is self-protection, borders. It's like, imagine if your body decided it didn't like the illegal immigrants called bacteria and said, you know what my body needs? My body needs a border wall, a really good, amazing border wall to protect me from the illegal immigrants of bacteria. This is a weird metaphor, I'm just now thinking. It seems absurd, and you would get sick. Well, that as a kind of symbol is what the world is like now. You can, in a very vulnerable and scary way, move toward your full cooperative participation in the universe, in the place that you inhabit, or you can choose the path of self-protection and self-defense, which is part of the limbic brain. It just happens to be the lowest level of consciousness available to human beings. It's what the rainforest first dreamed up and then kept going. So, what am I asking this morning? I guess to keep it kind of personal, what is your individual relationship like with the more than human world? What is it like? What is your unique and individual relationship like with the more than human world? You know, the only way to find out is to have a relationship with the more than human world. In a kind of exchange like breathing. Guess what? We know this scientifically. You are in cooperative breathing relationship with the plants around you. Now you can bring your more consciousness to that, or you can pretend that you're like, what do they call those little iron lung? That you're in an iron lung of your own self-made world. Isn't that what those things are called? Great song by Radiohead, by the way. Not all of you will get that. That has nothing to do with that reference to age earlier. All right. Oh, man. So, what is your individual relationship like with the more than human world? That means planetary issues are really spiritual issues. They're moral issues. They're ethical issues. And I think each being has its kind of its own unique role in this kind of conscious cooperation. So I really hesitate. Like in the old world, when I used to give sermons, I would like end with, "And you should do 3 things." You know. Actually, I don't know if I really did that. I did that occasionally. So maybe it's just in the form of question. What is your relationship like with the more than human world? What is your relationship like with the more than human world? What would it look like for you to sink in more fully to who you are on the deepest level? What would that look like? What would that look like for you to, I think maybe submit might be in a strange old-fashioned word, submit to the ebb and flow of the universe that you inhabit, to bring your conscious awareness to this unfolding relationship. And my final thought, I think, is this: the good life is about mutual enhancement and flourishing with the more than human world. That's, I guess, my statement. The good life, at least part of it, is about mutual enhancement. Now, is that always possible? I love when Joseph Campbell says, "Oh, so you're a vegetarian? Can't you hear the carrot screaming?" Nature is wild, you know, and the life-death life cycle is all around us. But that's not an excuse just because you're killing a carrot. That's not an excuse to desire the world to be such where the carrot lives in the soil in a mutually beneficial, life-enhancing and flourishing way. Not just for your benefit, but for the benefit of the bacteria that are invading your body at this very presence, and the bacteria that are in the ground that are surrounding the carrot. This is a kind of vision for the future that I think on the one hand is about as ancient as you can get, and on the other hand seems contemporary and fresh and the next phase in human evolution, at least in my view. And the final, I think, thought is, in case your narcissistic tendencies tend to creep up, which they will, remember, when the natural world is healthy, so are we. So let me end with a couple other lines here from this fantastic poem. Every man, every woman carries a firmament inside. Every man, every woman carries a firmament inside. And the stars are not only the stars in the sky. Without imagination, there is no memory. Without imagination, there is no sensation. Without imagination, there is no will or desire. History is a living weapon in your hand, and you have imagined it. Have a good week.